Kia ora, good evening. I'm Peter Walls, Chief Executive of Chamber Music New Zealand, and it is my huge pleasure to welcome you here tonight for this concert by the RNZ String Quartet. But in particular, I would like to introduce and to thank our pre-concert speaker, Elizabeth Kerr. Elizabeth is a former colleague of mine at Victoria University and then became Chief Executive of a number of organisations, including Creative New Zealand, and then was the manager of the New Zealand String Quartet. But most importantly, Elizabeth is a fantastically well-informed and interesting commentator on contemporary music. So we knew when we had these two new pieces by Alex Taylor that she would be the right person to talk about them. But also you can see that we've already got the stage set up for a string quartet, and that's the Aroha String Quartet, who are going to come out and play towards the end of Elizabeth's introduction. And that's something really quite special, and I'll leave it to Elizabeth to tell us why. But I would really, really like to thank the Aroha Quartet for being involved in this very, very special and quite unique, because no other centre in New Zealand is getting this very, very special presentation of Alex Taylor's work. So thank you, Aroha Quartet, and thank you, Elizabeth.
I'm focusing tonight on the new work that you're going to hear in the RNZ Quartet's program. And so I plan to spend a little bit of time, first of all, introducing you to a young New Zealand composer you may not have encountered before. When a composer responds to a commission, it's often for a musician or an ensemble that they know well. When Alex Taylor, whose new work will be played tonight, was commissioned by Chamber Music New Zealand to write for the RNZ String Quartet, it was the first time he'd been asked to write for a group he didn't know. He spent some time listening to recordings of the RNZ's work, but he was unable to meet them, and he didn't really have any correspondence with them either about the piece. The brief that he addressed was to write 2 miniature movements for string quartet, which could each stand alone or which could be played together, one after another, as one piece. And the composer admitted to me with a smile that he made an unwise decision, and in true creative fashion, he subverted that brief. So we'll talk about how he did that in a moment. Some of you will not have heard of this young composer, and some of you won't know much about him. If you attended Chamber Music New Zealand's Composer Connections concerts last year, you may have heard his set of 10 miniatures, Burlesque Mécanique, which is on the New Zealand Trio's most recent CD release. Here's a little sample of this music to remind you from the last 2 movements. They're called Chain and Scaffold, one gentle and one savage. And I've specifically chosen 2 contrasting sections of the piece. I'd like you to hold on to this idea of a strong and dramatic contrast. Alex Taylor's based in Auckland. He turns 28 this year, and he's already made his mark with a string of awards and performances. 4 years ago, he was the youngest recipient to date of the SOUNZ Contemporary Award, which is New Zealand's most prestigious composition prize, for a work which was a mini viola concerto called Inner, which was played by the NZSO and choreographed by the Royal New Zealand Ballet. With the same composition, he won the NZSO Todd Young Composer Award and the Orchestra's Choice Award. Here's the beginning of the work with some very lovely writing for the viola soloist. Since this very well-received and prize-winning piece, he's won a number of significant honours, including the 2013 Composers Association of New Zealand Trust Fund Award and a role representing New Zealand at the 2014 Asian Composers League Festival in Tokyo. In the first half of last year, he was the Castleberg Trust Creative Connections Artist in Residence in Broad Bay, Dunedin, creating work in response to the life and music of the late New Zealand composer Anthony Watson. My first pictures showed Alex as a thoughtful and serious award-winning young composer. But there are many sides to this talented artist, and his creative life and work epitomise the multifaceted lifestyle of a number of our up-and-coming young composer-musicians. The 19th century image of a lonely composer or an artist working in solitary anguish in a garret is very different from the life of the young composer in the 21st century. Many of these artists are out and about with their friends and colleagues, overturning stereotypes and audience expectations. Alex Taylor is a performer. He's a writer of a blog of music criticism and a published poet. He plays violin and saxophone. He sings and conducts, plays the keyboard, participates in several ensembles, including acting out, as he says, his extrovert rock star fantasies as David Bowie and others in the Blackbird Ensemble, led by his composer colleague and friend Claire Cowan. He also toured Australia last year in the backing band for Live Cinema. I mentioned a moment ago that he somewhat subverted the brief for this commission. We should not be surprised by this. It would be good if Alex could be here tonight to introduce himself and his piece, but he is right now busy with another artistic project, the second season of a piece called Dido and Aeneas Recomposed in Auckland at the Basement Theatre. That's our composer in drag, passionately singing the countertenor role of the sorceress in the opera, for which he is the music director, the recomposer, the person who rehearses the singers, and also plays the violin a little. The work takes the well-known opera by Purcell and writes over it, using music by, among others, Stravinsky, Beyoncé, and Thelonious Monk. He has also turned it into a promenade performance with a mobile audience. This work could be described as a palimpsest, and this word is relevant to the music we're going to hear in concert tonight. Here's the definition of a palimpsest. So it's something that has been overwritten. It is one approach to something we've become used to in postmodern art, the borrowing of material from one source and the creative recreation of that material. Palimpsest was the working title of the new piece we're hearing tonight. It has another name, as we've seen, but he started out thinking of it in this way. We'll find out why in a moment, but first I'd like to play you a short excerpt of another piece by Alex Taylor for string quartet. It's called Refrain and was written for the young New Zealand group, the Rothko Quartet, in 2013 for performance in the Royal Overseas League competition. I chose this short example not only because it's for string quartet, but also because it illustrates an important aspect of the work you'll hear tonight. Here, it's a marked contrast between what we could call stasis, a static quality, which in this piece is the refrain, and the solo parts for each player, which push the music forward. There's also opposition between the spacious solo playing and the rather brusque and aggressive refrain for the whole quartet. So now you're getting a sense of Alex Taylor's music. Let's talk about the work we'll hear tonight. The brief, as I said, for this commission was for 2 miniature movements for string quartet, which can each stand alone or can be played together. So the composer wrote 2 quartet movements with markedly contrasting characters, but created them, to use his own metaphor, on the same scaffolding so that they could be played not one after another, but simultaneously as an octet. There's at least one historical precedent for this approach, by the way. The French composer Mio did this with 2 of his string quartets. Numbers 14 and 15 can be combined. In talking about the piece, Taylor has referred to the contemporary condition of fragmentation and pluralism. He commented that increasingly we're being asked to be plugged in, on call, and multitasking 24/7. There's often a nagging feeling that you really should just devote your energies to one thing, but that you're forced to wear multiple hats simultaneously and continuously. This is the first page of the score. And whether or not you can read music, you can see that at the top there's not so many notes, and it looks rather peaceful. And at the bottom, it looks very, very lively. The top 4 parts of the system are the second quartet, and he wrote that first, and it's described on the score as luminous and floating. It's the more gentle and perhaps the more static piece, and the composer describes it as flexible, malleable, elastic, reflective. And then, in the spirit of a palimpsest, he overwrote this gentle piece with Quartet number 1, which you see at the bottom. And you can just see, just by looking at the score, it has different qualities. It's disruptive. It sometimes drowns out the quieter quartet. It has quite an aggressive quality. It has some of the contrasts we heard just now in refrain and earlier in burlesque mécanique. In the score, we see the words oppressive, stifling for Quartet 1. At times it's trying to stifle Quartet 2. So while in refrain the contrasts come one after another, can we say horizontally, so you've got the contrasting sections put against each other in time, in a coincidence of surfaces, when the two quartets coincide, as the title tells us, the contrasts occur vertically. The good news is that in Wellington tonight, you have an opportunity to hear each quartet separately as well as together. Right now, the Enzo Quartet are having a rest backstage on these comfortable couches. And in a few moments, we'll hear the Aroha Quartet, who are waiting offstage, play the Gentle Quartet 2. Then, in the concert itself, the Enzo Quartet will play the Aggressive Quartet 1. And finally, and we hope that everyone will stay to hear this, but finally, the two groups will combine into an octet, and we will hear the whole palimpsest. And there's one more piece of good news, well, depending on your musical preferences. The quiet qualities of Quartet 2 prevail in the end. The disruptive Quartet 1 drops out, and Quartet 2 completes the piece in gentle contemplative style. So, to hear Quartet 2, please welcome the Aroha String Quartet.